This broadcast of Cultural Caravan is paid for by Cultural Caravan Productions Incorporated.
My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we are joined by three distinguished guests. One of the guests is Dr. William Seraile, Professor Emeritus of African and African American Studies at Lehman College, and then Miss Soraya Nickens. She is a Cultural Caravan board member, as well as we call someone who has shared her thoughts on various programs here. Welcome back, Soraya. We have Basir Mchawi. He is a distinguished radio personality from WBAI Radio, as well as a distinguished educator. So as you know, everybody knows this is January, time we're taping is January. So we are basically going to talk right now about the legacy, the enduring legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to start off with our brother, Dr. William Seraile.
Yeah, hi, Louise. Thank you very much. Just a little fact that people don't know. Martin Luther King Jr. was born, and his name was Michael, not Martin. His father went to India because he was interested in Muhammad Gandhi. And he learned also about the Martin Luther, the Catholic priest who reformed the church. So his father took the name Martin Luther, and his son became Martin Luther King Jr. In December of 1985, I wrote an essay, and the title was MLK Day, which king do we honor, or shall we honor? And that was in a paper called The City Sun that was out of Brooklyn. A few years earlier, in 1983, Congress approved the King holiday, which was a major feat by itself to give honor to an African-American leader. In my essay, I raised the question, how are we going to honor him for his holiday? Now, we all knew at that time that King had a legacy, the March on Washington, the anti-war protests in 1967, the Poor People's Campaign. And so I raised that question. And unfortunately, to a large degree, when the first holiday came, even though there were people who marched, people who protested, people who read about him, a lot of the advertisers, capitalistic, began to take advantage of the holiday by using slogans like marching and protesting as part of their pitch to sell liquor, to sell food in restaurants, to sell furniture, cars, and so forth. Anybody have time, you can go back and look at magazines of that time period, and you can see all these ads for, like, come on down, march on down, like, we had signs in liquor stores, like, or bars saying 2 for the price of 1. And so they thought that King was just another commodity to exploit. And unfortunately, some people agree with them. The honoring of Dr. King means you're honoring him not only as a leader, but as someone who had a vision. And his vision was a society that would be one devoted to equality. And this is why King preached against the war in Vietnam, because he realized money that should be used for poor people, for projects, was used to kill people, to cause a great deal of problems. King sought to talk about the issues of poverty, which still exist today. In many cases, these issues are much more available and much harsher today than they were in the 1960s. What we have here is a king who needs to be honored and to be respected in a manner that befits him and does not be done in a manner that's going to benefit advertisers. And be very careful because too often our leaders are sanitized by the media. And so we might try to honor him. And I know there's always some young kids who can recite "I Have a Dream" speech, but we have to be careful that when they do that kind of speech, they should do the whole speech, and not simply the part that just deals with black boys and white boys walking hand in hand. So there are many ways to honor Dr. King, but don't fall prey to the advertisers because they'll do anything they can to sell Dr. King to the public and to make more money for themselves. My essay was in the City Sun. It's the last week in December 1985. City Sun's on file at the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture.
I would like to focus on Dr. King's effect internationally. While we know that he was definitely a very important figure to African Americans, he was also renowned all over the world, and he had an effect all over the world. His effect here was obviously to release African Americans from the bondage of injustice. We were not treated as full citizens, and we were always shown in a negative light all around the world. Dr. King's movement changed all that. It showed Black Americans in a sympathetic light and showed what we were really after was just simply to have the privileges and rights as all other American citizens had, or at least European American citizens. So that's what we were looking for. And because of the injustices that African Americans and indignities and humiliations that African Americans were forced to endure every day, people just got fed up. And Dr. King was the catalyst because he was a great leader to lead these protests. We have absolutely been affected positively by this movement. Before that, Black people couldn't live where they wanted. They couldn't go to work where they wanted. A lot of public amenities that our tax dollars help pay for, like pools and clubs and community centers, were closed to African Americans through the race. And all of this changed as a result of the civil rights movement. Around the world internationally, America had very discriminatory immigration laws where foreigners who were people of color were simply not allowed into the United States and certainly not allowed to become citizens. People from Asia, people from Latin America, all over, people of color were barred entry due to the fact that they were not white of European heritage. And once the civil rights movement happened and changed America and changed those discriminatory laws, everyone was allowed to come into the country. So a lot of the folks who are here now and doing well, even a whole lot of people who are not Black, but they still benefited from the civil rights movement because now they can come, they can prosper, they can go to school, they can build that better life that they wanted to have. And the better life is due to the fight of the civil rights martyrs. It never would have materialized without the fight of the civil rights movement and without the success of the civil rights movement. And so we honor Dr. King because he was such a pivotal figure in the world, and he made possible the lives, the great lives that we live. So many Black people, myself, everyone, if it wasn't for Martin Luther King, most of us would not have been in the positions we're in because a lot of discriminatory regulations and laws were abolished. And so that opened the floodgates of Black advancement. There were Black people who also were denied housing, not just denied housing, but had their houses destroyed. Everyone's heard of Rosewood. They've heard of Black Wall Street. Well, these things, of course, we haven't heard of those things happening after the Civil Rights Movement. So laws that just were discriminatory held Black people back and just allowed the government to do any type of heinous behavior that they felt like to hold Black people and Black progress back. All of those were swept away. I mean, things are not perfect now, but thank goodness we had people who were courageous enough to fight for our rights so that now we can enjoy the fruits of their labor. Their fight was not in vain. And we are grateful to people like Martin Luther King and the civil rights people, because without them, we would not be, we would not enjoy what we do today. And America wouldn't be the great place that everyone looks upon it.
I think the first thing we have to do is we have to see if we can put the civil rights movement in some kind of context, if in fact we want to understand Dr. King and we want to understand the revolutionary aspects of Dr. King. The civil rights movement, for the most part, was a Southern Christian movement. In the North, the civil rights movement was quite different, if in fact we even want to call it that. And we have to thank, of course, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and his national spokesperson, Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, for that movement, which actually started in these northern cities and took hold there. You know, when we look, Nation of Islam didn't take hold in the South during the period that we talk about as the civil rights period. The other thing I think we have to do is we have to see if we can talk about the civil rights movement in regards to the years when it was most effective and most actually working. And that is, if we take a 25-year period, I would say that that 25-year period would be between 1945 and 1970. The other thing I think we have to understand is that the civil rights movement is limited in regards to its success, because here we are in 2025 and people are looking at, well, what's going to happen in terms of the Voting Rights Act? What's going to happen in terms of the Civil Rights Act? What's going to happen in terms of people voting? Are people literally going to be able to vote, or are there going to be some restrictions? And we see that there's been attempts for the last few national elections to go ahead and suppress the vote of Black people specifically and progressive people in general. So I think it's important to understand that the civil rights movement, while it had a great impact, that the impact was somewhat limited. And at this particular point, we're seeing the limits of that. The question that we have to ask ourselves now in 2025 is which way forward. I think Dr. King in his later years gives a very interesting example in terms of his moral stance, in terms of his progressive and radical vision. And let's just talk very briefly in regards to that. On April 4th, 1967, Dr. King gives his famous "Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam" speech. A year later, exactly on April 4th, 1968, he was assassinated. Now, this, of course, raises a number of different questions. I mean, first of all, I believe that we have to look at the involvement of organizations, agencies like the FBI and the CIA in regards to his assassination, because obviously it was somewhat symbolic. If in fact you're going to go ahead and exactly 1 year after he makes this particular speech, he's assassinated, to me, it means something. And I think it's supposed to mean something to all of us who have outlived Dr. King. Now, the idea that King would go ahead and come out against the Vietnam War when he did was really something that had almost nothing to do with the mainstream civil rights movement, the leadership of the civil rights movement at all. As a matter of fact, most people had said, Dr. King, don't do that. And when he did it, he was met with vile kinds of things. At the time of Dr. King's death, he was not especially popular. And he wasn't popular because of his stance against the war in Vietnam, and also, of course, the idea that he was now looking at not just civil rights, but human rights in a way that would actually have to go ahead and look at the question of economics. And that's why he went ahead and attempted to try to start a poor people's campaign. And it was that same campaign that led him to Memphis, where he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968.
And this time, I'm going to ask each of you to kind of reflect on basically what steps forward, certain things as we move into our next half hour, and just for what you want people to do, taking your ideas and thinking, letting them to think about what's next and so forth, or what the next step should be.
Well, I think that right now, a lot of progress was made since Dr. King. You have many more successful Black people. Black people are in all walks of life. Those areas that we were not held back in, we've excelled at. I think the power structure was always happiest when we were singing, dancing, throwing balls, but they were always fearful and threatened when we were serious and dealt with businesses, especially businesses in our community, which traditionally have always been inhibited because of that feeling that somehow Black economic power was, and probably still is, a threat to certain aspects of our society. But people have to realize the civil rights movement made tremendous strides in this country. It actually changed the country, which is why Martin Luther King was so held in fear, and the society felt threatened, because it really changed things. You have to understand, we were never expected to get as far as we got in the society. We were dragged over here as slaves, and we were never expected to become what we became. So that movement is a pivotal movement, not in American history, but also in the world.
Well, I think that if we want to understand the civil rights movement better, the struggle for human rights, the continuing struggle of African people, because as some people would say, it ain't over. We have to continue to go ahead and struggle. And I think that sometimes when we attempt to try to put the civil rights movement in some kind of historical box, it's something like, well, that was then, and we can rest on our laurels and everything will be okay. But that's not the case. The other thing I think we need to look at is we need to look at the role of the agencies that I mentioned before, like the FBI and the CIA, not only in regards to Dr. King's assassination, but also in regards to the fact that this nation was as frightened as they were of the movements that were actually coming out of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, Dr. King wrote a lot of books and had a lot of speeches that are available online. And obviously you need to look at these things to get a better perspective of him. There are two things that I'd like to mention. Dr. King talked about Black Power. He didn't like the phrase Black Power. He thought it was kind of vague, but he said he did believe in economic power and political power. Now we go back and you realize that we didn't have that many members of Congress at that time. We didn't have that many members who were mayors of cities or other kinds of political operatives. But he talked about economic power, and basically the same vein that Dr. King talked about was very similar to what Malcolm X has said. And that was that we have a lot of money that we spend, but we don't spend it necessarily among ourselves, and it doesn't help us to advance economically. So he talked about that, and that's in the context of the war in Vietnam. And that's why he spoke out on April 4th, 1967. And in Vietnam, it was a war basically between Vietnamese, but became an American war of aggression. I was in Vietnam at that time when he was assassinated. I was not in the military, but I was there in a program. I was teaching English in a Vietnamese high school in the Mekong Delta. So I had a very close look at the war. But King was talking about how the war, how young men were drafted, and many of these young men were of color, and they weren't color, they were white kids from the Appalachia or from small towns. And he talked about that in the context of the Poor People's March. Now, you wouldn't think, well, why would Dr. King go to Memphis? Because there was a local strike by sanitation workers. Well, King was able to show that the salaries they received was barely enough to keep their families alive. So he went to show solidarity with the striking sanitation workers. And that's what he meant by economic power. The fact that we need to have control and not always be the ones who are the consumers, but the ones who are able to produce as well. And if he was live today, I think he'd be very disappointed on both fronts. Disappointed, not so much about the numbers that we have in politics, but about the what we fail to do as politicians. And I think he'd be upset with the fact that we have a lot of millionaires, but we don't seem to own things that are necessary for the average person, like the corner grocery store or the hardware store. And so I think what Dr. King taught us is we need to take a look back and to learn to use his teachings to make our own progress forward.
I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. And please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. And also, you can download the Cultural Caravan app on your phone, either iPhone or Android. Go visit the Play Store and just tap in Cultural Caravan TV, and you can have Cultural Caravan with you on your phone 24/7. Until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.
This broadcast of Cultural Caravan is paid for by Cultural Caravan Productions Incorporated.